Hello and welcome to today's Lux Research webinar, Plastics in Peril, Building a Realistic Roadmap to Plastic Sustainability. My name is Kevin C. I'm a VP and Group Director here at Lux, and I'll be moderating today's session. Our speaker today is Anthony Schiavo, a Research Director here at Lux. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on your screen. Time permitting, we'll answer as many of those questions as we can. And if your question doesn't get answered, don't hesitate to email questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. And with that, I'd like to introduce Anthony Schiavo.
Thanks, Kevin. I want to start in 1967 with the film The Graduate. Here, you can see our hero getting a piece of advice. One word: plastics. In the film, this represents stability, security, and the economic promise of the future. But things have changed for plastics. Today, John Oliver is doing a segment on plastics, really talking about the dangers and the harms of plastics and the failures of the plastic recycling system. This video on plastics got millions of views across YouTube, HBO, Facebook, and it also got plastic apologists foaming at the mouth. However, it represents the current state. Plastics are public enemy number one in the eyes of consumers, and especially those who care about sustainability. So, how did we get here? Well, I'm going to boil recent events down to two headlines, both from 2017. The first was Blue Planet 2 topping the 2017 TV ratings. This documentary really focused on the ocean, and in particular, it contained a call to action from David Attenborough about the damage that plastic waste was doing to the ocean. This really inspired a lot of anger in people. And then secondly, China enacted the National Sword Policy, which basically prevented any sort of plastic waste imports into China. Now, at the time, China was taking 40% of the world's plastic waste, so this is a huge disruption. Over the next couple years, we've seen major disruptions to both international and local recycling. On the international level, multiple national bans ultimately ended up with the Basel Convention limiting plastic waste trading, really eliminating a lot of types of mixed and dirty plastic waste trading, which substantially reduces recycling globally. And this has precipitated a lot of failures on a local level, with individual cities shutting down collection after not being able to find anyone to take their plastic. This has led to a growing awareness of the failure of existing recycling systems for plastic. You can see PET and HDPE are recycled at reasonable rates, although lower than paper or aluminum. But PVC, PP, PS are barely recycled at all. And overall, the recycling rate is quite low. There's growing awareness among consumers that there's a lot of issues here. This has also led to more and more regulatory action on plastic and plastic waste. In the EU, there's now a tax on non-recycled plastic, and we expect this is going to drive demand and packaging away from plastic towards other materials. In the US, there's been the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act proposed, which would institute a national EPR scheme, among other things. So there's a real regulatory reckoning coming for plastic waste. Now, the consequences of screwing this up are real. This image went viral on Twitter after a so-called paper bottle was exposed as really just being a paper label. But it's not just about getting roasted on Twitter. There's billions of dollars at stake in this sustainable plastics transition. So in the next decade, plastics players need to build out recycling infrastructure to make sure that their products don't get banned or restricted. Brands need to keep meeting those product requirements while minimizing exposure to consumer backlash, to fines, and to regulatory penalties. And governments need to find the right frameworks that accelerate change. So just a quick disclaimer. As we talk about the future of sustainable plastics, I'm not here to judge. If you're looking for an answer to the question, are plastics sustainable? Well, you're going to leave disappointed. Our predictions are based on a lot of different types of models. However, they also fundamentally rely on our opinions about different technologies, regulations, and the fate of consumer perception. So while I'm not here to judge much, I am going to be rendering judgment on a couple different technologies and approaches. Okay, so how did we predict the future of plastic sustainability? Well, we started by creating a forecast of baseline demand growth for plastics at about a 2% compound annual growth rate. Then we built a cost model of recycling approaches, which we used for both mechanical recycling, and we also modeled more advanced recycling techniques. Thirdly, we built a bioplastics landscape and predicted scale up through 2030. We made specific predictions about regulations through 2030, and then we combined all these together with a forecast of recycling, bioplastic bans, and alternatives to really build a roadmap for plastic sustainability. Now, I've been talking a lot about plastics, but what specifically are we going to focus in on here? We're going to really be talking about the big 6 commodity plastics, which are also plastics numbers 1 through 6. You see them at the left here. We're largely going to ignore everything in that other category. There's a huge number of different types of plastics, engineering plastics. While together they make up a large portion of production, individually they're smaller portions of production. One important note, you're going to hear me use the phrase mixed plastic waste. This refers to a mixture of numbers 3 through 7. It's typically dirtier, and it's really problematic and challenging to recycle. So this is an important thing. We're going to keep talking about this. Then what are the options we have to deal with these issues and improve the sustainability of plastics? We're going to look at bans on specific products and materials. We're going to look at mechanical recycling and depolymerization of single types of plastics. Pyrolysis, which is a potential solution to mixed plastic waste. And lastly, we'll consider the role of bioplastics and alternatives. Okay, so what's the current state of plastics production? Well, in 2020, we think about 94–95% of plastics are conventionally made. Just about 5% of plastics output is from recycling, and probably less than 1% is from bio-based sources. So how is this going to evolve through 2030? Well, by 2030, we predict bans will take about a 5% haircut off of plastic production. This is primarily going to come from bans on bags and bans on EPS. In the US, 10 states have already begun to ban plastic bags for single-use applications, typically bags thinner than a certain thickness. And many more states have regulations on the way. This isn't just a US phenomenon or an EU phenomenon, however. There's a long history of bans and attempted approaches in India on single-use plastics. And in China, they're increasingly aggressive about banning bags, especially in cities. So we're really seeing a global spread of regulations targeting some of the most problematic form factors. But it's worth noting that these are really targeting form factors that are in the public eye as well. Second, we're expecting to see an expansion of recycling. Now, in 2020, about 5% is recycled. We're expecting about a 13% of plastics output to be recycled in 2030. I should say coming from recycling sources. That means it's going to almost triple over the next decade. It's really substantial growth. This is our forecast of all the different types of recycling here. And what you can see is that there is a pretty good diversity of different approaches. Both mechanical and depolymerization are going to see substantial growth. However, the overwhelming majority of this growth is going to help just two main types of plastics, HDPE and PET. These are already the plastics that have the highest recycling rates. So the rich are going to get richer here, but this does not represent a solution to that problematic issue of mixed plastic waste. So let's look at pyrolysis. Pyrolysis is essentially a thermal process which breaks plastic waste down into some sort of oil, which can then be turned potentially into fuels or more plastics. Now, the advantage of this is that it can take a wider range of mixed plastic waste, particularly polyolefins. However, our forecast is that pyrolysis will just make up just 0.5% of global plastics production. What's the reason for this? Well, it comes down to an issue of yield. About 75% of that plastic is turned into pyrolysis oil during the initial process. Then you have about a 90% yield on hydrotreating, which is necessary for cracking those oil into plastic products. But then when you take that barrel of pyrolysis oil and you put it in a conventional steam cracker, you're only going to get maybe 15 to 17% plastics out at the end. So fundamentally, you're talking about a maybe 10, 11 to 15% yield on a ton of plastic waste into plastic output through a pyrolysis process. This yield is simply so low, it's just not a good way to make plastics. That doesn't mean pyrolysis is a bad technology overall necessarily. You can do pyrolysis to make a lot of different types of products, fuels, oils, and it's possible that pyrolysis could be more sustainable than incineration. However, it's not going to contribute substantially to plastics production. And then lastly, looking at bio-based and novel alternative materials, we think these are going to grow substantially, almost tripling over the next decade. But bio-based plastics are still just going to capture around 1.5% of production overall. One of the things that's going to limit these materials is increasing concerns about their sustainability. You know, the biggest opportunity or the biggest driver for bio-based plastics is that they have a much lower carbon footprint, and that's important. However, groups are increasingly concerned about a number of the trade-offs that are happening. Bioplastics have increased land usage. In some cases, it can result in increased energy consumption. Often there is increased water consumption and water pollution from the agricultural techniques. And in a lot of ways, bioplastics don't really represent a good solution to waste. Yes, there are biodegradable bioplastics, but the reality is that those plastics often end up in landfills, and we're still pretty far away from an optimal biodegradable solution. So when you put all this together, what you get is that 85% of plastics will still be conventional in 2030. But, you know, there's a lot that's good here. We're roughly tripling the volume of sustainable plastics. And if you are a certain kind of plastics maker or consumer, for example, if you're consuming bottles, PET or HDPE bottles, the future looks pretty good for you. However, there are issues here. This scenario really represents the failure of mixed waste recycling. There's even more problematic issues, however. If you look at overall volumes, consumption of conventional plastics is really not going to grow that much at all, you know, less than 0.5% over the next decade in our view. Most of that growth is going to be captured by recycling and a little bit by bio-based and sort of some of these bans, alternative materials like paper stepping in. So if you are a major producer of plastics, especially polyolefins, you have a serious situation here. We've generally failed to solve the issue of mixed plastic waste, but we're also in a situation where there's not a lot of growth happening for conventional plastics production. What does this, highlighted area represent in terms of dollars? Well, you're talking about $45 billion in lost primary plastics production. So overall, we predict that, yes, a lot of progress is going to get made. You're really talking about tripling the amount of sustainable plastics on the market in just 10 years. That is substantial. Still, a lot of sustainability goals are not going to be met, especially the issues surrounding films and other types of challenging plastic waste. And despite failing to meet sustainability goals, the plastics industry will really struggle to grow. So I know that's kind of a downer. What could change our outlook on this? One thing that could change this would be regulatory acceptance of mass balance approaches. Now, mass balance is a type of accreditation system in which you track inputs, say 1 ton of sustainable inputs, and you're able to assign those to outputs and say, okay, we've used 1 ton of sustainable inputs, and that has produced 1 ton of sustainable outputs. It's great for the chemical industry because it's really basically impossible to physically track sustainable inputs as they flow through a refinery system. You can use this for bio-based feedstocks. You can also use it for something like pyrolysis oil. But there's an advantage here, which this ability to assign sustainable inputs to certain outputs lets you bypass that yield issue I talked about earlier, especially if you're using only a low input of sustainable inputs in a larger refinery mix. What does this amount to? Well, regulatory acceptance of mass balance would increase recycled plastics output by 14 million tons by effectively lifting the yield of pyrolysis approaches. However, it's worth noting that this increase is only on paper. The actual physical processes haven't really changed. There's a lot of questions here. Will regulators really accept this? I'm skeptical. And even if they do, what is the value of a mass balance polymer? It's certainly not the same as recycled. And will consumers really accept something that is complicated, isn't easy to tell the story of the sustainability value? I'm not certain. I think a lot of chemical industry players are counting on this coming to fruition. And I think there's a lot of risk here that they're not willing to acknowledge. Well, the second thing we could do to increase recycling rates, increase sustainability, is standardization. If you look at any product that is recycled at a high level, it is always a standardized product. In the US, the bottle recycling rate is 29%, while the overall recycling rate for plastics is just 8%. What you can really see is the only plastics that are recycled are bottles because of that standardized form factor. MRFs, waste management companies, and recyclers can easily tell what that bottle is made of and easily sort it out and separate it from the rest of the waste stream. So standardization really lends itself to high recycling rates. Now, there's a lot that can be done in terms of standardizing products and eliminating problematic articles. But we can go further. And I actually think we're going to see more standardization around the types of plastics. Now, this suggestion is a little extreme, so bear with me here. But PVC, polypropylene, and polystyrene are the 3 plastics that today have the lowest recycling rates. So what if we banned them? There'd be a ton of benefits. First of all, PVC is really problematic for pyrolysis. So this would really easily help enable that scale up of pyrolysis. Secondly, you dramatically simplify the waste sorting requirements. You'd basically only need to pull out PET and HDPE from a mixed polyolefin or a mixed plastic waste stream. You could even go further and ban PET. Now, it might sound crazy nuking more than half the plastics industry from orbit, but there are a lot of advantages here. I think you need to ask yourself seriously, is it going to be easier to find an LDPE or HDPE product that has the gas barrier properties of PET, or build a waste collection and sorting system which can take all these different types of wastes. I think there's a lot of opportunity around standardization. Yes, this would cause economic pain, but there's not going to be any sustainability without economic pain. And lastly, we can question this fundamental assumption that volumes are going to keep going up. Certainly a lot of groups seem to take this as a given, right? The IEA, even in their sustainable development scenario, is confident that the production of chemicals is going to keep going up pretty substantially. But eliminating demand growth really gets us much closer to sustainability targets. And the reality is that volume growth and sustainability are fundamentally opposed to each other. If you look at here on the slide, we have our 2020 and our 2023 scenario, or excuse me, our 2030 scenario in total volumes. If you assume no volume growth, we get a lot closer to meeting that target. First, we're able to limit the amount of non-sustainable plastics flowing into our system. You're really talking about 30 million tons closer to a goal of 100% sustainability. So eliminating demand growth has a huge potential impact on our sustainability targets. Okay, so what can you do about all this? Well, if you're a plastic producer, you need to do two things: pivot your business models and your products. Now, people are already beginning to pivot their products. A lot of chemical companies like the Siam Cement Group are investing directly into recycling, and that's a great start. But I don't think chemical companies are doing enough to change their business models, especially when it comes to decoupling their revenue growth from their volume growth. People always clown on Tesla because they make more money selling regulatory credits than they do selling cars. But I kind of think that's the business model of the future. A chemical company could put themselves in a situation where, to supplement decreasing physical sales of plastics, they start selling credits or some other sort of assurance that those plastics are sourced sustainably and have a sustainable end of life, essentially charging for the circularity of their plastics. There's a real opportunity here, and emerging sort of regulatory schemes are beginning to allow for this type of business model. What about if you're a brand owner? Well, there's two things that are really crucial: transparency and design for sustainability. There's an old adage, right? You can't manage what you can't measure. And so it's really crucial for both the supply chain as well as for consumers to be as transparent as possible. This company, Vega, does a great job. You can see everything that goes into their shoe and exactly how much is natural, bio-based, recycled. This is the kind of transparency that's going to be necessary to convince consumers that your products are sustainable. And if you have this type of transparency, you can begin to easily identify pain points and design around them. And the second thing is you've got to design for reduced consumption. We can't, just take away plastics and products and the quality of life they bring from people. So we need to design solutions that can reduce consumption while maintaining that quality of life, while maintaining those products. So it's really going to be up to the brands to achieve that by redesigning and eliminating, reducing their consumption. I want to thank you, and we're going to now open it up for questions.
Thanks a lot, Anthony. Appreciate that. We'll now be taking questions that any of you have on the presentation, so just punch that into the questions box. If we don't get to those, to your questions, we'll be in touch after the webinar. And let me just pull up a few questions, Anthony, that I see coming in. The first one is, isn't mechanical recycling downcycling, and won't we need pyrolysis because of that?
Yes, this is a good question. So just to clarify, downcycling, that is this idea that you're turning waste into a product that's not as useful or not as valuable. And it's true often when you mechanically recycle products, you turn bottle waste into carpeting, for example. So I think, however, I think about downcycling a little differently. I think about it in energetic terms. Mechanical recycling is really favorable energetically. You're not putting that much energy in, but you're still getting a plastic product out. You compare that to something like, incineration, kind of at the worst end. You're incinerating something, you're putting a fair amount of energy in, and you're only getting a minimal amount of energy out in terms of electricity and heat. With pyrolysis, yes, it is something that you can turn back into useful products like plastics or fuels or oils, but you're putting a fair bit of energy in there. So I think you're going to see a system where mechanical recycling is always the most favorable approach. And it's really something where pyrolysis is just used as kind of a measure of last resort. I think we're pretty far away from an economy, a situation where we have so much recycled plastics circulating that it begins to create issues. We will get there eventually, but I think we're still pretty far away from that. And the first priority should be expanding mechanical recycling.
Thank you. The next question is, what do you think generally is the biggest driver for sustainability? We have got company initiatives and wanting to do more, implement more sustainable policies, consumer demand, more policy. So what are the balance of those things, what do you think is driving these sustainability initiatives?
Yeah, I really see it as a policy-driven space. We really think regulations are crucial here. Yes, there are technologies that are going to emerge and help make the circular economy more economical. And certainly consumer pressure is, on some level, driving policy. But the reality is that it's the need to conform to policy, whether it's an extended producer responsibility, whether it's the impacts of the plastic waste tax. That's really what's going to drive a change in this sort of overall plastic system that we have. So we do really see it as a policy-driven space.
And just a follow-up question from me along those lines is, in the scenarios you outlined towards the end there was a few things that could change your outlook. From a policy perspective, I know it's hard to predict policy, but do you envision any potential dramatic changes in policy that could really change the picture over, the next decade or so?
I think the most dramatic thing that could happen, the country to watch, is China. They've already, shook the whole space once with the China National Sword. And there's a lot of different potential outcomes there. Potential resumption of imports. It's challenging now because of the Basel Convention, but it's possible. A major ban on more types of plastic, tighter regulations around waste. There's a lot that could happen. Or on a positive side, they could be a huge adopter of pyrolysis or any of these technologies if China puts in credits or incentives or any other thing there. So, I'd really watch China and their sustainability policy. I think in other regions, things are going to proceed more gradually, but China, can really move quickly.
Thanks for that, Anthony. I think we have time for one more question. And the last one is, you threw up a big number about the $45 billion in plastics production that's potentially lost. And the question here is, do you think stakeholders like, for example, chemical companies are prepared for some of these scenarios that you presented?
In some ways, yes. In some ways, no. I think they're prepared from a technology side, or they are beginning to prepare themselves. Certainly chemical companies are investing in a lot of technologies. They're working on a lot of tools here to try and mitigate these issues. But I don't know how much they're really thinking about these alternative business models. I think that they're still very much in a mode of trying to preserve those existing business models. And the reality is, there can't be sustainability without a substantial decrease in volume growth. Ideally, we'd like to sell less plastics, right? That would be the most sustainable outcome. So these chemical companies, they really need to start thinking about the business models that are going to enable that and enable them to maintain revenue while doing that. I don't think they're really engaging with that just yet.
All right. Thanks a lot, Anthony. That concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation recording will be sent to all attendees via email later today. After leaving, you will have a prompt to complete a survey on the presentation. This is really helpful for us as we iterate and improve our presentations and webinars. So we'd appreciate any feedback you have there. And with that, thank you everyone for joining today. Thank you, Anthony, and have a great day.